Hey guys, welcome back to the Crafty Boy. Today, we're building a floating castle diorama. First, let's take a look at the 3D model for this project. The design includes a floating rock base, a fantasy castle, and a waterfall flowing down from the island above. I wanted the entire piece to feel like a magical kingdom floating in the sky. Next comes the 3D printing process. For this project, I'm using a resin printer to capture all the fine architectural details on the castle. For models with lots of towers and arches like this, support placement is extremely important. After several hours of printing, the final result turned out really clean. Next, I started working on the base section. The lower area will become a magical lake environment. First, I hollowed out the bottom and waterfall sections so I could later create realistic resin water effects and add more depth to the composition. For the lower terrain, I used XPS foam board to fill the base structure. After that, I used a mixture of plaster and white glue to create the texture of the lake bed. After finishing the base and waterfall structure, I moved on to the priming stage. Primer helps improve paint adhesion and also makes it easier to spot imperfections on the model surface. After the primer dried, I first applied a dark gray base coat to both the castle base and the lake area. Once several base layers were built up, I used diluted black paint to flow into the rock crevices and deepen the shadows. Then, I dry brushed the rock surfaces using a cool gray color. For this step, I used a sponge dabbing technique to create more natural texture variation. Now it's time to create the resin lake effect. First, I sealed the edges of the lake area using masking tape. For the water, I used transparent resin mixed with blue pigments to create a magical lake appearance. I also added a small amount of transparent black pigment to deepen the blue tones. After mixing, I used a vacuum pump to remove bubbles from the resin. When pouring resin, it's important to pour slowly to minimize trapped air bubbles. Next comes the castle painting process. For the stone walls, I mainly used layering and dry brushing techniques to enhance the texture. For the base color, I chose a cool gray tone created by mixing gray with a small amount of blue. For the shadows, I applied a dark brown wash, focusing especially on the brick gaps and structural seams. Then, I dry brush the edges using a light beige-gray color to create highlights. For the rooftops, I painted them using a dark blue-gray tone. This stage takes quite a bit of time, but it's also where the model changes the most visually. After the lake resin fully cured, I also sanded the surface for a cleaner finish. Before making the waterfall, I first fixed the floating castle above the lake base. Now it's time to create the waterfall effect. To simulate flowing water pouring down from the floating island, I used hot glue strands to guide the flow and secured everything using UV resin. After that, I continued layering additional water effects to build up more texture and depth. The glowing blue waterfall is also the main visual centerpiece of the entire project. It connects the upper and lower sections beautifully. This is definitely one of my favorite parts of the build. Finally, I started adding scenic details. I applied static grass around the rocks and lake edges to make the environment feel more natural. Even though these details are small, they greatly improve the overall atmosphere of the scene. After adding a few final highlights and touch-ups, the diorama was finally complete. Now the floating castle truly feels like a complete fantasy world. If you enjoy fantasy miniature projects like this, don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel. Also, let me know in the comments which part of this build was your favorite. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next project.